It's awesome to see so many smiling faces today. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be exploring the complete story of Baby Daddy That's Not Your Kid. Covering the key events, major plot twists, and unforgettable moments that make this drama so captivating. If you're new here, consider subscribing and enabling notifications to stay updated with our latest drama recaps and story breakdowns. Now, without wasting any time, let's begin the recap.
The neon lights of the city bled through the frosted glass of the service corridor, casting long, distorted shadows against the sterile white tiles. Betty clutched the heavy plastic handle of her mop bucket, her knuckles white with exhaustion. The harsh scent of industrial bleach clung to her uniform, a smell she had long grown accustomed to, though it still stung her eyes after a 12-hour shift. She was invisible here, just another nameless face in a sea of gray uniforms, tasked with scrubbing away the messes left behind by the city's elite. But beneath the drab exterior, a fierce determination burned. Every scrub, every late-night shift, every aching muscle was a stepping stone. "Careful, don't screw up those nice and clean pants," a voice sneered from the doorway of the women's lounge. Betty didn't need to look up to know who it was. Sarah and Jessica, two of the floor supervisors who seemed to draw a sadistic pleasure from tormenting the cleaning staff. They stood leaning against the doorframe, their lips curled into identical, mocking smirks. "Still think you're better than us?" Jessica added, her tone dripping with venom. "Scrubbing toilets like a common stray." Betty tightened her grip on the mop. She took a slow, deep breath, refusing to let them see the sting of their words. She stood up straight, meeting their gaze with a fiery defiance that startled them for a brief second. "I am better than you to bullies," Betty said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "I'm saving up for medical school. I have a future, while you two will be stuck in this corridor, gossiping and tearing people down for the rest of your entire lives." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken rage. Sarah's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "Oh, oops," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. She stepped forward, deliberately kicking the mop bucket. Soapy, gray water sloshed over the rim, soaking Betty's shoes and the hem of her pants. "You're going to die today, bitch. No, stop." Betty cried out, stumbling backward as the two women advanced, their polished nails looking like claws under the fluorescent lights. "I'm going to carve up your face," Jessica threatened, lunging forward. Betty turned and bolted down the service hallway, the squelch of her soaked shoes echoing against the walls. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She ducked into the first open door she could find, a dark, expansive VIP suite that was supposed to be vacant. She slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her, plunging the room into near darkness, and leaned against it, gasping for air. "Shh!" A voice suddenly groaned from the darkness. Betty froze. The sound was guttural, raw, and laced with agonizing pain. "Help me, please," the voice rasped again. Through the thick oak door, Betty could hear the muffled voices of her tormentors outside in the hall. "Toilet scrubbing slut," Sarah spat, her voice muffled but distinct. "Probably fooling around with some man whore in there. Let me call the manager. He needs to take care of you to stray dogs." Wait. What are you doing?" A frantic, authoritative voice interrupted from the hallway. It was the shift manager. "You two are being too loud. Get out of my sight or no one will ever hire you in this city. Run!" The hurried clicking of heels faded down the corridor, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Betty let out a shaky breath, sliding down the door until she hit the plush carpet. But her relief was short-lived. Another tortured groan ripped through the darkness of the suite. Betty scrambled to her feet, her eyes adjusting to the dim moonlight filtering through the heavy drapes. She moved toward the bedroom, her medical training limited as it was to textbooks and night classes kicking into high gear. On the massive king-sized bed lay a man. He was writhing, clutching his chest as if his heart were trying to burst through his ribcage. Betty cautiously stepped closer, recognizing his face from the glossy covers of Forbes magazine scattered in the staff break room. E.L. Carter, the brilliant, ruthless CEO of Apex Corp. "What happened to you?" Betty whispered, dropping to her knees beside the bed. His eyes were half open, glazed over with a feverish haze. His skin was flushed, radiating an unnatural, terrifying heat. "I was dragged," he gasped, his chest heaving with every syllable. Aphrodisiac, Betty's mind raced. She reached out, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. His pulse was a frantic, terrifying flutter under her fingertips. His skin wasn't just warm, it was burning. Skin burning, heart racing, Betty muttered to herself, her eyes darting around the room as she mentally scrolled through her textbooks. Her breath hitched as the realization dawned on her. Classic male hypothermia induced by a chemical overdose. Your body is overheating, but your core is shutting down. She looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. The numbers glared a menacing red. There's no time to get to her. If I don't do something right now, he'll die. Panic threatened to choke her, but she shoved it down. She was going to be a doctor. She had to act. Come on, Betty grunted, grabbing his heavy arms and pulling him toward the edge of the bed. I need to get you to the bathroom. With immense effort, she dragged the billionaire across the floor, his dead weight nearly pulling her down with him. She managed to haul him into the sprawling, marble-tiled bathroom and practically threw him into the massive walk-in shower. She twisted the cold water valve as far as it would go. A freezing torrent rained down upon them both. Carter gasped violently, his body going rigid as the icy water hit his overheated skin. The cold water will bring down your core temperature, Betty shouted over the roar of the shower, holding him up as the freezing water soaked through her uniform, chilling her to the bone. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. But instead of calming down, Carter's tremors grew more violent. His breathing became shallower, a terrifying rattle taking over his chest. I don't know. I don't think it's working, Betty cried out, her medical knowledge hitting a dead end. She held his face in her freezing hands. Carter looked at her, his dark eyes wide with primal panic. I feel like I'm going to die, he choked out, his voice cracking. He reached up, his large, trembling hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. Oh, please, please help me, help me. He pulled her closer, the chemical fire in his veins demanding a release that cold water alone couldn't provide. The aphrodisiac had completely hijacked his nervous system. Betty stared into his desperate, dying eyes. She knew what he needed. She knew the only way to stabilize his surging, erratic heart rate before it gave out entirely. It was a terrifying, monumental line to cross. What is a mistake? The thought echoed in her mind. If I let him die, that is a mistake. Are you sure? She whispered, the freezing water pasting her hair to her face. Carter could only nod, a pathetic, desperate plea in his eyes. You helped me by keeping me hidden from them just now, Betty said softly, her voice trembling as she made the heaviest decision of her life. I'm helping you. Then we're even. As the icy water continued to cascade around them, Betty surrendered to the dark, desperate night, saving the life of a man whose world was galaxies away from her own, unaware of the inescapable chain of events she had just set into motion. The morning sun broke through the city smog, painting the sky in pale, bruised colors. Betty slipped out of the hotel suite like a ghost, leaving the sleeping billionaire tangled in the damp sheets. Her body ached, her mind felt fractured, and her wet uniform clung uncomfortably to her skin. She had done what she had to do. She had saved a life. But as she rushed through the crisp morning air toward her tiny, run-down apartment, a profound sense of shame and exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. She burst through the door of her cramped apartment, her chest heaving. Penny, save me, I'm dying, she gasped into her phone, having dialed her friend the moment she was out of the hotel. Don't panic. I'm on my way, Penny's voice crackled through the receiver, laced with sleep but instantly alert. Betty dropped her phone on the kitchen counter and collapsed into a cheap vinyl chair. She buried her face in her hands. That was when Ivy emerged from the small hallway. Ivy, her roommate and supposed friend, looked disheveled, dark circles pooling under her eyes. She leaned against the wall, chewing on a thumbnail. I need help, Ivy blurted out, not even noticing Betty's state. Duke's gambling again. He wants money from me. I'm broke, Betty, and he's going to kill me. Ivy placed a trembling hand over her stomach. And he can't hurt my baby. Betty looked up, her own trauma momentarily eclipsed by her friend's terror. You have to leave him, Ivy. You can't keep doing this. I can't face this baby alone. Please, Betty, please. I just need help one more time. I don't have anything, Betty whispered, her voice hollow. I don't have anything left to give. Ivy's eyes darted around the room, landing on the heavy, expensive-looking suit jacket Betty had draped over the sofa, a jacket she had grabbed from the hotel suite in her panicked rush to cover her shivering shoulders. Before Betty could process what was happening, Ivy lunged for the jacket. "What are you doing? Attack!" Betty yelled, too exhausted to put up a real fight as Ivy rifled through the pockets. Ivy pulled out a gleaming, heavy silver watch. The face of the watch caught the morning light, practically screaming of unimaginable wealth. "Where'd you get something this nice?" Ivy demanded, her eyes wide with greedy realization. "That's not yours." Ivy, wait. "Come on," Betty pleaded, reaching out. But Ivy was already backing toward the door, her fingers tightly wrapped around E.L. Carter's priceless timepiece. The heavy oak doors of the hotel manager's office felt like the gates of a prison. Betty stood before the massive mahogany desk, her damp uniform still clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The exhaustion from the night's harrowing events weighed on her shoulders like lead, but the manager's sneering face only fueled the simmering anger in her chest. "I was just told that you were seducing a guest instead of working," Mr. Henderson said, his voice dripping with condescension as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't even look up from his paperwork. "Sarah and Jessica reported that you locked yourself in a VIP suite. This hotel caters to the elite, Betty. We do not tolerate staff fraternizing or whatever sordid activities you were engaging in with the clientele." Betty's jaw clenched. "That's a lie. I was hiding from them because they were harassing me. And then there was a medical emergency." "Save your excuses," Henderson interrupted, slamming his pen down. "I'm docking your pay this month. Consider it a lenient warning. Next time, you're out on the street." A suffocating silence filled the room. Betty thought of the medical school brochures on her kitchen table, the empty fridge, the rent that was already past due. But as she looked at the smug, dismissive man before her, something inside her snapped. The fear of poverty was suddenly eclipsed by a profound, undeniable sense of self-worth. She had saved a man's life last night. She had sacrificed her own dignity to pull someone back from the brink of death. She was not going to be treated like dirt on the bottom of someone's shoe. "You know what?" Betty said, her voice eerily calm, ringing with a newfound authority. "I quit." Before Henderson could formulate a response, Betty turned on her heel and marched out of the office, shedding the oppressive weight of the hotel with every step. Miles away, in the sunlit penthouse of the same hotel, E.L. Carter awoke with a sharp, ragged gasp. He bolted upright, his chest heaving as his senses slowly pieced the world back together. His head throbbed with a vicious, rhythmic ache, but the unnatural, agonizing fire in his veins had been extinguished. He looked down at his hands, then at the tangled, damp sheets beneath him. Flashes of the previous night hit him like lightning strikes. The ambush at the charity gala, the spiked drink, the desperate, stumbling retreat into the nearest empty suite. The agonizing heat that made him feel like his organs were melting. And then, the cold water, soft, trembling hands. A woman's voice, terrified but resolute, whispering that she was making things even. Carter threw off the covers and stumbled toward the living area, his sharp eyes scanning the room. It was empty. The mysterious savior was gone. He snatched his phone from the marble counter, dialing his head of security. "Get a team up here immediately," Carter ordered, his voice hoarse but commanding. "I was drugged last night. Someone tried to take me out. But more importantly, find me the woman who was in this room. She saved me. I need to know who she is." Across town, the air in the underground pawnshop was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. Ivy nervously drummed her chipped fingernails against the scratched glass counter, her eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. "I need cash now," Ivy demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "Duke is going to find me. Just give me whatever it's worth." Behind the counter, an elderly jeweler with a loupe pressed to his eye was intensely studying the silver watch. He turned it over, his breath hitching as he read the microscopic engraving on the inner clasp. He slowly lowered the watch, looking at Ivy with a mixture of awe and deep suspicion. "Miss," the jeweler said slowly, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper, "this is Mr. E.L. Carter's personal timepiece. It's bespoke. There is only one white gold piece like this in the whole world." Ivy swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. "So, it's mine now. Are you going to pay me or not?" The jeweler didn't answer. Instead, his hand slid beneath the counter, pressing a silent alarm that connected directly to the private security firms of the city's elite. Less than 10 minutes later, the pawnshop doors were thrown open. 3 men in immaculate black suits stormed in, their presence instantly sucking the oxygen from the room. "Hey, what are you doing?" Ivy shrieked as two of the men grabbed her arms, hauling her toward the door. "Let me go! Mr. Carter is looking for you," the lead security officer said coldly, holding up the gleaming watch. "Bring her to the penthouse. Now!" When Ivy was unceremoniously dropped onto the plush carpet of the penthouse suite, she was trembling uncontrollably. She looked up and felt the breath leave her lungs. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window was E.L. Carter. The magazines did not do him justice. He was imposing, exuding an aura of absolute power and ruthless intelligence. "Mr. Carter," the security lead announced, "we found your woman." Carter turned around. His dark eyes locked onto Ivy. He took a slow step forward, looking at her disheveled state, the fear in her eyes, and the slight, barely noticeable curve of her stomach. He remembered the darkness, the desperation, the transaction of salvation. "You had my watch," Carter said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. "You were the one in the dark last night?" Ivy's mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour. She thought of Betty, exhausted and wet. She thought of the abusive boyfriend she was fleeing. She thought of the baby growing inside her Duke's baby and the life of absolute poverty that awaited her. Then, she looked around the opulent penthouse. This was her golden ticket. All she had to do was lie. "Yes," Ivy whispered, forcing tears into her eyes, playing the part of a traumatized victim to perfection. "It was me. I didn't know what else to do to save you." Carter closed his eyes, a flicker of genuine gratitude crossing his stoic features. He had no reason to doubt her. The darkness had blinded him, and the watch was the ultimate proof. "You saved my life," he said softly. "I take care of my own. You will never have to worry about anything ever again." Ivy lowered her head, hiding the wicked, triumphant smile that crept onto her lips. 6 years later. "Mommy, I don't like this shirt," a small, frustrated voice echoed from the tiny bathroom of a modest downtown apartment. Betty leaned against the doorframe, a warm smile spreading across her tired face. She held a steaming mug of cheap coffee, watching her nearly 5-year-old daughter, Emma, tug furiously at the collar of a bright yellow t-shirt. Emma was a whirlwind of energy, with eyes as bright and observant as a hawk's. "What's wrong with it, sweetheart? Yellow is your favorite color," Betty said softly. Emma huffed, crossing her tiny arms and pointing to the base of her neck. There, sprawling across her collarbone, was a distinct, jagged birthmark. It was a deep crimson red, shaped almost like a cresting flame. "It shows my birthmark. It's so ugly." The kids at daycare stare at it. Betty's heart ached. She set her coffee down and knelt beside her daughter, taking Emma's small hands in hers. "Emma, look at me. It is not ugly." She gently traced the edge of the red mark with her thumb. "It looks like you're on fire. It's fierce. It's so cool." "Whatever," Emma mumbled, though a tiny smile threatened to break through her pout. "Oh, hey." Betty leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a dramatic, secretive whisper. "I think it looks cool, and your dad has one too." Emma's eyes went wide, the shirt completely forgotten. "Really? What does he look like? I want to know." Betty's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a pang of ancient grief tightening her chest. She looked away, staring briefly out the small apartment window. "I'd like to know too," she thought bitterly. "After 6 years, I've forgotten the face of the man in the dark." She turned back to Emma, replacing her sorrow with a bright, convincing smile. "Emma, you're almost 5 now. I think it's time for me to tell you the truth about your daddy," Emma gasped, leaning in. "What is it?" "Actually," Betty whispered, "he's a superhero." "Really?" Emma squealed, practically vibrating with excitement. Then why doesn't he come to pick us up from school?" Emma asked, her logic as sharp as ever. Betty tapped Emma on the nose. "Oh, well, he's very busy saving the world. He only comes when we're in danger." Before Emma could interrogate her further, Betty's ancient cell phone buzzed violently on the counter. "Oh, hang on, sweetheart. Mommy has a call. It might be the clinic about that family doctor position." As Betty rushed to the kitchen, Emma wandered out the front door, stepping into the busy, sunlit lobby of their apartment building. She was mimicking superhero poses, pretending to shoot lasers from her hands, when she tripped over a stray floor mat. She braced for impact, but it never came. A large, incredibly strong hand caught her by the shoulder, steadying her effortlessly. Emma looked up. Standing before her was a towering man in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit. He had sharp, handsome features, dark, piercing eyes, and an aura of complete control. Emma stared at him, her eyes wide as saucers. To a 5-year-old raised on stories of world-saving protectors, the math was simple. Tall, strong, caught her before she fell. "Daddy," Emma cheered, wrapping her small arms around the man's expensive tailored leg. E.L. Carter froze, looking down at the tiny girl attached to his knee with utter bewilderment. He had just stepped into the building to inspect a new real estate acquisition, and now he was being claimed as a parent. "Oh, my Emma, stop!" Betty came sprinting out of the apartment, her face flushed with horror. She rushed forward and gently but firmly pried her daughter off the billionaire's leg. "I am so sorry, sir. That is not your dad, Emma." Emma looked from Betty to Carter, undeterred. She put her hands on her hips and looked up at the towering man. "Then can you be my daddy? My mommy is amazing, beautiful, kind, and she can cure sick people." Emma puffed out her chest proudly. "Plus, now it's buy one get one free. Am I right?" No, sorry," Betty stammered, deeply mortified. She pulled Emma behind her, avoiding the man's gaze. "Kids, you know, overactive imaginations." Carter stood there, surprised by the sudden warmth blooming in his chest. For a man whose life was dictated by cold calculations and ruthless boardrooms, this absurd, joyous little creature was a startling anomaly. A genuine, rare smile broke across his stoic face. "It's okay," Carter said, his deep voice remarkably gentle. "I think she's really cute. Daddy, we should go." Emma piped up from behind Betty's legs. "Thank you for saving my life, Daddy," Carter chuckled, adjusting his cuffs. "It's my pleasure." Betty quickly scooped Emma into her arms, muttering a final, embarrassed apology before retreating into the safety of their apartment hallway. As they hurried away, Betty paused by the mailboxes, glancing out the lobby's glass doors. A sleek black limousine was parked by the curb. The tall man walked toward it, and as the back door opened, a woman leaned out to greet him. Betty froze. The world tilted on its axis. The woman was draped in designer silk, her hair perfectly styled, dripping with diamonds. But beneath the glamour, the face was unmistakable. "Ivy, who were you just talking to?" Ivy's voice drifted through the open lobby doors, sharp and haughty. Betty pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. That voice. Ivy. Betty, when did she come back? Betty thought, her mind spinning in shock. Ivy could never afford those clothes. It can't be her. What is she doing with him? Okay, I'm coming, Betty muttered to Emma, rushing back toward their apartment, unaware that the ghosts of her past were rapidly closing in around her. The Carter estate was a sprawling monument to modern architecture, a fortress of glass and steel perched on the edge of the city. Inside, it was completely silent, utterly immaculate, and devastatingly cold. Ivy sat at the edge of the massive dining table, pushing a piece of heavily seasoned salmon around her porcelain plate. She wore a dress that cost more than Betty's entire apartment building, yet she had never felt more impoverished. Carter walked into the room, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He didn't look at her. He rarely did. Len said that she might want a baby brother, Ivy said, her voice tight, trying to force a casual intimacy that had never existed between them. What do you think about that? Once I'm pregnant with your child, I won't have to worry anymore. Carter stopped pouring his water. He turned to her, his expression a mask of pure ice. What are you doing, Ivy? I'm trying to be your family. Ivy snapped, standing up, the chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. It's been 6 years, EL. 6 years. And you won't marry me. You won't touch me. Like, what even am I to you? Carter slowly placed his glass down. He closed the distance between them, his towering presence forcing Ivy to shrink back. Look, Ivy, Carter said, his voice terrifyingly calm and devoid of any affection. I told you many times. You only live here because you're the mother to my child. He gestured vaguely toward the upper floors, referring to the boy Ivy had brought into his home, a boy he believed was the product of that chaotic night in the dark. Not because I have feelings for you. Not because we are lovers. Ivy's lip trembled, tears of genuine frustration and humiliation prickling her eyes. You saved my life, Carter continued, his tone clinical. I repaid the debt by giving you a life of luxury and raising the boy. But my gratitude does not equate to love. So, if you're not okay with that arrangement, you can leave any time. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ivy standing in the suffocating silence of the dining hall. Furious, Ivy spun around, her eyes landing on a young maid, Blair, who was quietly dusting a nearby vase. What are you doing? Ivy shrieked, projecting all her rage onto the terrified girl. Stop it. You're useless. Everything is dirty. Blair dropped her duster, tears welling in her eyes. I'm not done cleaning yet, Miss Ivy. I've had enough. Blair suddenly cried out, overwhelmed by years of Ivy's tyrannical abuse. I quit. Oh, you idiot. Ivy laughed cruelly as the girl ran from the room. Leave. People wanting to work for this family, people wanting to be our family doctor could form a line from here to Paris. Ivy stood alone in the grand room, her fists clenched, terrified of the fraudulent empire she had built on a foundation of lies. The hiring process for the Carter family doctor was being held in the grand ballroom, a space that felt more like an interrogation chamber than an interview room. Betty stood in the center of the vast, echoing space, holding Emma's hand tightly. Her resume was tucked into a modest leather portfolio, and she had spent the entire morning rehearsing her answers. She glanced down at Emma, who was staring up at the vaulted ceilings with wide, curious eyes. "Okay, let's go," Betty whispered, smoothing her hair. She had managed to secure this interview through a series of persistent applications, desperate to move past her string of dead-end jobs. As they reached the registration desk, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the air. "Why is she here?" Betty froze. Sitting on a velvet-covered chair near the entrance, looking every bit the queen of this cold fortress, was Ivy. She was sipping sparkling water, her eyes narrowing as they landed on Betty. Ivy stood up, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. She approached them, a smirk playing on her lips, not of recognition, but of cruel amusement. "I don't go out, and I certainly don't recruit the help." Ivy turned to the security guard standing at the doors. "Who let the two beggars in here?" Hi," Betty said, her voice steadying as her protective instinct over Emma surged. "I'm Betty Garcia. I'm here to interview for Mr. Carter's personal doctor position." Ivy laughed, a brittle, sharp sound. "How could Mr. Carter hire a poor wretch like you as a doctor? And with baggage, too." She gestured dismissively toward Emma. "Get these two frauds out of here." "Wait, you're not," Betty started, trying to find her voice, but a group of well-dressed, arrogant candidates began to laugh and murmur around them. "Don't bully my mommy," Emma shouted, stepping in front of Betty, her small hands balled into fists. Ivy's face darkened with genuine malice. "How dare you speak to me like that?" She reached out, clearly intending to shove the child aside. "Hey!" No, she didn't mean anything. Betty jumped forward, pulling Emma back, but the contact was enough. In the chaos, Emma stumbled against a heavy metal serving trolley that had been left in the center of the room. The sharp edge of the trolley struck the back of her neck right over her unique birthmark and grazed her shoulder. Immediately, Emma began to gasp, her hands flying to her throat. "Emma!" Betty's heart stopped. She saw the pale, sickly tint spreading across her daughter's skin. "Emma, I feel terrible. I can't breathe." The room descended into bedlam. Candidates moved aside, whispering about a freak having a medical emergency. "Hang on," Betty said, her voice dropping into a professional, frantic tone. She dropped to her knees, her hands flying to her bag to pull out an emergency kit. No, what are you doing? She's allergic to metal. She'll suffocate if she doesn't take her medicine." Ivy stood back, her arms crossed, looking bored. "Cut the acting. Get her out of here. Mommy, save me." Emma wheezed, her eyes rolling back. Betty felt the world closing in. She grabbed the EpiPen-like device she had kept, but it was malfunctioning. The latch stuck. She looked up at the ballroom doors as Mr. Carter strode in, his face stern and focused. "I'm begging you, just let me use his paper, she's dying." Betty cried out to the room at large. "So what's that have to do with me?" One of the other candidates scoffed. Suddenly, a heavy, polished shoe kicked the offending metal trolley away, sending it clattering across the floor. "Mr. Carter?" someone whispered. E.L. Carter stood over them, his gaze fixed on the dying little girl. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his own inner jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek, customized metallic case. He popped it open, revealing a syringe filled with a specialized, glowing blue liquid. "What's wrong with her?" he demanded, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "She's having an allergic reaction," Betty sobbed, watching as he expertly administered the medicine to Emma. The silence in the room was absolute. Within seconds, Emma's gasping ceased, and the natural color began to return to her cheeks. She blinked, looking up at the man who had caught her in the lobby just days before. "This medicine works fast," Carter muttered, his brow furrowed as he watched his own rare antidote work exactly as intended. "Daddy? You saved us again," Emma whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Thank you so much." Carter stood up, his gaze shifting from the little girl to Betty. He looked at the medical bag, at the way Betty had handled the emergency, and then back at Emma. "You're fired," Carter said, turning his gaze toward the staff member who had orchestrated the removal of the beggars. He didn't even look at Ivy. "Get out now, Mr. Carter. I've worked with you for so long. Please don't do this. I swear, I'll never do anything like this ever again." The staff member shrieked. "Then go be a toilet cleaner," Carter said coldly. "I don't care. Just get out of my sight." He turned back to Betty, who was shielding Emma, her eyes wide with shock. "That was hurting my daughter," Carter said, his voice dropping into a dangerously protective tone. "Don't you ever mess with a mother again." He looked down at Betty, his expression unreadable. "I'm here for the interview," she reminded him, her hands still trembling from the terror of the moment. Carter let out a short, hollow laugh. "Well, your first task is to properly take care of your own injury," he said, gesturing to a scrape on her arm. "You mean I'm hired?" Carter didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned his attention to the empty syringe he had used on Emma. He looked at the girl again, a strange, haunted look crossing his face. "Mr. Carter?" Betty asked tentatively. "Where did you get that medicine? It worked so quickly. She's had a severe metal allergy her whole life. I'd like to buy some." Carter's hand froze. He looked at Betty, then at the girl. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's also allergic to metal?" He paced a few steps away, then back. The room seemed to shrink. Not many people are so allergic to metal, he thought. Could Emma be my child? He looked at Betty, his eyes piercing. When was she born? The question hung in the cavernous ballroom, heavier than the crystal chandeliers suspended above them. When was she born? E.L. Carter's chest rose and fell with a sharp, uneven rhythm. His piercing dark eyes were locked onto Betty, searching her face with a terrifying intensity. The air in the room seemed to have been entirely vacuumed out. The remaining candidates and the bewildered staff stood frozen, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere but unable to comprehend it. Betty swallowed hard, her protective instinct wrapping around her daughter like a physical shield. "Why does that matter?" she asked, her voice trembling but defensive. "You just saved her life." "I am incredibly grateful, Mr. Carter, but her medical history." "When was she born?" Carter repeated, each word a definitive strike. It was no longer a question. It was a demand from a man who commanded empires and unraveled mysteries for breakfast. The rare metal allergy was an anomaly, a genetic curse that had plagued the Carter bloodline for generations. It wasn't just uncommon. It was virtually impossible to find in a random child off the street. Betty pulled Emma slightly behind her leg. "October 14th, she said quietly. 5 years ago." Carter closed his eyes. The math was instantaneous, hitting his mind like a physical blow. October 14th, exactly 9 months after the night of the charity gala. 9 months after the aphrodisiac, the agonizing heat, and the freezing shower. From across the room, Ivy watched this exchange with mounting horror. The blood drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her pulse hammered in her ears so loudly it drowned out the ambient murmurs of the crowd. "No, no, no," her mind screamed. "This can't be happening. Not now. Not after I've secured my place." Ivy practically sprinted across the polished marble floor, her heels echoing like gunshots. She shoved her way past 2 bewildered security guards and wedged herself between Carter and Betty. "E.L., darling, please," Ivy cried out, her voice shrill and desperate, dripping with manufactured concern. "Don't engage with these people. She's clearly a scam artist. She probably researched your medical history to pull some kind of elaborate con. Let security throw them out. This is embarrassing." Carter didn't even look at Ivy. He simply raised one hand, a silent, absolute command for her to stop talking. The sheer authority radiating from that single gesture made Ivy's jaw snap shut, her teeth clicking together. He bypassed Ivy entirely, stepping closer to Betty and the little girl. He crouched down slowly, bringing himself to eye level with Emma, who was still clutching her mother's pant leg, breathing easily now thanks to the customized antidote. "Emma, right?" Carter asked, his deep voice miraculously softening, shedding the ruthless billionaire persona entirely. Emma nodded, her big, bright eyes studying him. "Yes, Mr. Superhero Daddy." A faint, strained smile touched Carter's lips. He remembered the brief encounter in the lobby just days prior. He remembered the little girl complaining to her mother about a shirt. He remembered the exact words she had used. "It shows my birthmark. It's so ugly. It looks like you're on fire." Earlier this week, Carter began, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I heard you tell your mom that you didn't like your shirt. You said it showed a mark." a mark that looked like fire. Betty's breath hitched. She looked at Carter, a profound, terrifying realization beginning to bloom in the back of her mind. The timeline, the allergy, the sheer magnetic pull between this man and her daughter. And then there was Ivy. Ivy, who had miraculously come into immense wealth right after Betty had saved the man in the dark. Ivy, who had stolen the heavy silver watch. "Can I see it, Emma?" Carter asked softly. "Can I see your birthmark?" "Don't touch her," Betty warned instinctively, reaching out. But Emma, ever brave and strangely trusting of the towering man who had just pulled her back from the edge of death, gently tugged the collar of her yellow t-shirt down. There, resting at the base of her neck, spreading across her delicate collarbone, was the jagged, deep crimson birthmark. Carter stopped breathing. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he reached up to the collar of his immaculate dress shirt. He undid the top two buttons and pulled the expensive silk fabric aside. Betty gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Etched into the skin of E.L. Carter's neck, extending down toward his own collarbone, was the exact same mark. The same jagged edges. The same deep crimson hue. A perfect, undeniable mirror image. The cresting flame of the Carter bloodline. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp, terrified intake of breath from Ivy. Carter stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Betty's face. The pieces of a 6-year-old puzzle were violently slamming into place. The woman in the dark, the cold shower, the desperate plea for help. He turned his head, his gaze finally locking onto Ivy. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was a cold, absolute void that promised complete destruction. "The watch," Carter said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The silver watch you brought to the pawn shop 6 years ago. Where did you get it, Ivy?" Ivy stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the carpet. I told you. I was there. I saved you, E.L. I saved you from the fever." Tears began to stream down her face, stripping away her glamorous facade and leaving behind the pathetic, terrified opportunist she truly was. "We have a life together. Don't let this street trash ruin what we have." "You're lying," Betty's voice rang out. It wasn't a shout. It was a steady, resonant truth that cut through Ivy's hysterics like a scalpel. Betty stepped forward, the years of exhaustion, poverty, and struggle momentarily eclipsed by a blinding, righteous fury. She looked at Carter, really looked at him. Without the fevered haze of the aphrodisiac, without the suffocating darkness of the hotel room, she recognized the sharp jawline. She recognized the broad shoulders she had desperately hauled into the shower. "The VIP suite at the Grand Azure," Betty said, her voice shaking but her gaze unwavering. "Room 402. You were burning up. You couldn't breathe. I dragged you into the walk-in shower and turned the water all the way to cold." Carter's eyes widened, a flicker of profound shock breaking through his icy exterior. "You told me you felt like you were going to die," Betty continued, the memories flooding back with crystal clarity. "I told you that you helped me hide from the women who were bullying me. I told you that helping you made us even." Carter took a step toward her, the space between them suddenly crackling with electricity. "It was you," he breathed out, the revelation washing over him like a tidal wave. "All this time, it was you." "Betty, shut up!" Ivy screamed, lunging forward with her hands curled into claws, desperate to silence the woman who was dismantling her entire universe. Before Ivy could even close half the distance, 2 towering security guards intercepted her, grabbing her arms and holding her back. She thrashed against them, screaming obscenities, her mask of high society elegance completely shattered. "She stole my jacket that morning," Betty said, turning her attention back to Carter, refusing to look at the wretched woman who had once been her roommate. "I took your suit jacket because I was freezing in my wet uniform. I brought it back to my apartment. Ivy took it. She stole the watch from the pocket." Carter stared at Betty, seeing the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes, the faded, cheap clothing she wore, and the fierce, protective stance she held over their daughter. He realized the magnitude of what had been stolen from them both. For 6 years, the woman who had saved his life had been living in poverty, raising his heir alone, while a parasite lived in his home, squandering his wealth. "Get her out of my house," Carter commanded, his voice echoing through the ballroom. He didn't even glance at Ivy as she was dragged kicking and screaming toward the massive double doors. "Freeze all the accounts associated with her name. Have the legal team draw up the eviction and fraud papers immediately. If she ever steps foot within 10 miles of this estate again, have her arrested. E.L. You can't do this to me." I'm the mother of your son. Ivy's voice echoed back from the hallway, a desperate final plea. Carter flinched slightly at the mention of the boy, but his resolve didn't waver. He would deal with the tragic complication of Ivy's child later. Right now, his entire universe had narrowed down to the two people standing in front of him. He turned back to Betty and Emma. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was gone. In his place stood a man violently confronted by his own monumental failure to see the truth. I am so sorry, Carter whispered, the words carrying a heavy, uncharacteristic vulnerability. He looked down at Emma, who was holding tightly to Betty's hand, looking between the adults with wide, observant eyes. Are you really my superhero, Daddy? Emma asked softly, breaking the heavy tension in the room. Carter dropped to his knees again, ignoring the fact that his expensive suit was pressing into the floor. He looked at the little girl, the fire birthmark, the stubborn chin, the sharp, intelligent eyes that were a perfect reflection of his own. Yes, Carter said, his voice cracking with emotion. He reached out, his large, trembling hand gently brushing a stray curl away from Emma's forehead. I am. And I am never going to let you go. He looked up at Betty, the fierce, resilient woman who had scrubbed floors to provide for a child she thought she had to raise alone. You're not just hired, Betty, he said, the promise ringing with absolute certainty. You're home. The transition from the cramped, damp walls of Betty's downtown apartment to the palatial expanse of the Carter estate was nothing short of whiplash. By nightfall, Betty and Emma were relocated into a guest suite that was larger than the entire floor of Betty's previous building. The walls were adorned with original Impressionist paintings, and the bed, an imposing four-poster masterpiece, was draped in silk sheets that felt like spun water against the skin. Emma, exhausted by the day's traumatic events and the adrenaline crash that followed, had fallen asleep the moment her head hit the down pillows. She looked small, but finally safe, nestled in the center of the massive mattress. Betty, however, could not sleep. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering skyline of the city. Down there, in the maze of neon and shadow, was the life she had fought so bitterly to survive. Up here, suspended above the clouds, everything felt surreal. It felt like a dream she was terrified of waking up from. A soft knock at the door broke the heavy silence. Come in, Betty said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. The heavy oak door creaked open, and E.L. Carter stepped into the room. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. The top buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, revealing the faint crimson edge of the birthmark that tied him to the little girl sleeping on the bed. Without the armor of his corporate attire, he looked weary. He looked human. Is she asleep? Carter asked, his voice barely a murmur as he stepped carefully onto the thick Persian rug. Out cold, Betty replied, offering a faint, strained smile. The allergy antidote took a lot out of her, but her breathing is perfectly normal. No wheezing. It's a miracle drug, Mr. Carter. E.L., he corrected her softly, stepping closer to the window but keeping a respectful distance. Please, call me E.L. After everything. Formalities feel absurd. Betty nodded slowly. E.L. then. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the city lights flicker below. The space between them was filled with 6 years of unspoken words, of a shared history that had been brutally hijacked by a thief. I need to apologize, E.L. said, breaking the quiet. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight with repressed guilt. When I woke up in that hotel room 6 years ago, my head was spinning. The drug they slipped me had nearly fried my nervous system. I remembered the cold water. I remembered the pain, and I remembered your voice. But I didn't remember your face. He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes shimmering with an intense, raw sorrow. When Ivy was brought to me, she had my watch. It was a custom piece, one of a kind. There was no logical reason for anyone else to have it. I wanted to believe I had found the woman who saved me, so I did. I blinded myself to the inconsistencies. I let my gratitude become a cage. Betty sighed, leaning her forehead against the cool glass of the window. Ivy was always opportunistic. We were roommates. She was dating a violent man named Duke who was constantly drowning in gambling debts. The morning after the hotel, I came home completely exhausted. I was terrified. She saw the jacket, found the watch, and saw her way out. E.L.'s hands clenched into fists at his sides. I forced you to struggle. I forced you to raise our daughter in poverty while I handed millions to a parasite. You didn't force me to do anything, Betty said firmly, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were fierce, devoid of any self-pity. I worked. I fought. I kept Emma safe, and I kept studying because I am going to be a doctor. Ivy took your money, but she never took my drive. I didn't need your wealth to be a good mother, El. El stared at her, deeply moved by the unyielding strength radiating from her. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted his money, his influence, his power. But the woman standing before him, the mother of his child, wanted none of it. She only wanted a chance to build her own life. I know, El whispered, a profound respect settling over his features. And you will be an incredible doctor, Betty. But you no longer have to fight alone. I am here, for Emma, and, if you'll allow it, for you. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Carter estate shifted from quiet reconciliation to cold, calculated retribution. E.L. Carter was a man who did not tolerate betrayal, and the magnitude of Ivy's deception required a systematic dismantling of the life she had built. Betty sat in the sunlit breakfast conservatory, sipping Earl Grey tea while Emma happily devoured a plate of meticulously crafted blueberry pancakes, courtesy of the estate's private chef. For the first time in her life, Emma didn't have to ask the price before asking for seconds. E.L. walked into the room, a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. He kissed the top of Emma's head, a gesture that already felt incredibly natural, before sitting across from Betty. My security team has been busy, E.L. said, sliding the folder across the marble table. I needed to tie up the final loose end. The boy, Betty paused, placing her teacup down gently. Ivy's son. The boy she claimed was mine, E.L. corrected, his tone turning clinical. For 6 years, I provided for him. I gave him the Carter name, the best tutors, the finest clothes. But I always felt a disconnect. I thought it was simply because I felt no affection for his mother. But the truth was genetic. He tapped the folder. I had a DNA test rushed overnight, swabbed his toothbrush and compared it to my own profile. Zero match. The boy is not mine. Betty let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Then who is the father? A man named Duke, E.L. said, his lip curling in disgust. The same man you mentioned last night. Ivy was pregnant when she arrived at my penthouse with the watch. She used the timing of the hotel incident to pass the pregnancy off as mine. Duke has been in and out of prison for the last 5 years for grand larceny and illegal gambling operations. What will happen to the boy? Betty asked, her maternal instinct flaring despite the fact that the child belonged to the woman who had ruined her life. It wasn't the child's fault. E.L.'s expression softened slightly. I am ruthless, Betty, but I am not a monster. The boy knows nothing but this life. I have set up an irrevocable trust fund for him. It will cover his education and basic living expenses until he is 25, administered by an independent legal team. But he will be relocated to a boarding school in Switzerland. He is no longer a Carter. And Ivy? Ivy has been stripped of every asset purchased with my money, E.L. stated, his eyes turning cold again. The jewelry, the cars, the penthouse she bought her mother all repossessed. She is currently sitting in a holding cell downtown facing charges of grand theft, extortion, and criminal fraud. She is looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Betty looked down at her hands. There was no joy in Ivy's downfall, only a profound sense of closure. The ghost that had haunted her for 6 years had finally been exorcised. The scales of justice, horribly imbalanced for so long, had finally leveled out. It's over, E.L. said, reaching across the table and gently placing his hand over hers. His touch was warm, grounding. The lies are done. Now, we build the truth. The transition from strangers bound by a shared secret to a functioning family was not instantaneous. It required patience, countless late-night conversations, and the slow, deliberate dismantling of walls they had both built to survive. For E.L., it meant learning how to be a father. He had commanded thousands of employees and dictated the flow of global markets, but nothing terrified him more than braiding a 5-year-old's hair. Emma, however, made it incredibly easy. She worshipped the ground he walked on, fully embracing her superhero daddy. He learned her favorite colors, her imaginary friends, and exactly how to slice the crust off her sandwiches. For Betty, the adjustment was even more profound. E.L. did not try to smother her with his wealth, understanding that her independence was the core of her identity. Instead, he became her greatest champion. 3 months after the unmasking at the estate, Betty sat at the massive mahogany desk in E.L.'s private study, surrounded by towering stacks of medical textbooks. She was chewing the end of her pen, frustrated over a complex chapter on neuroanatomy. E.L. walked in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one down beside her and peered over her shoulder at the textbook. Taking a break? he asked, his deep voice rumbling near her ear. I can't, Betty sighed, leaning back and rubbing her temples. The entrance exams for the university's accelerated medical program are next month. If I don't nail this anatomy section, I won't make the cut. El pulled up a chair beside her. You will make the cut. You saved my life without a medical degree. Imagine what you'll do with one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, embossed envelope, placing it on top of her textbook. What is this? Betty asked, eyeing the envelope suspiciously. Open it. Betty carefully broke the wax seal and pulled out the thick parchment paper. It was a legal charter for a new philanthropic foundation, the Emma Carter Medical Initiative. Below the title, listed as the Chief Director of Operations and lead beneficiary of the scholarship program, was her name. E.L., Betty whispered, her eyes welling with tears. It's an initiative designed to provide full-ride medical scholarships to single mothers, E.L. explained, his eyes locking onto hers. Women who have the brilliance and the drive but lack the resources. It's fully funded, and you are going to run it. Once you have your MD, Betty covered her mouth, the sheer magnitude of the gesture washing over her. It wasn't just a gift. It was a profound validation of everything she had suffered through. It was the ultimate proof that he saw her, respected her, and believed in her. You don't have to carry the weight of the world alone anymore, Betty, E.L. said softly, reaching out to wipe a stray tear from her cheek. Let me share it with you. She leaned into his touch, the last remnants of her guarded armor finally falling away. In the quiet sanctity of the study, surrounded by the blueprints of their future, Betty leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss built not on the desperate, frantic energy of the dark hotel room 6 years ago, but on a foundation of profound respect, healing, and undeniable love. 3 years later, the Grand Azure Hotel was alive with the thrum of classical music and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. It was the annual Apex Charity Gala, the very same event that 9 years prior had set a chaotic chain of events into motion. The grand ballroom was packed with the city's elite, but tonight all eyes were drawn to the top of the grand staircase. E.L. Carter stood there, looking as formidable and impossibly handsome as ever in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo. But the cold, untouchable aura that used to define him was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, radiating warmth. He extended his arm, and a woman stepped into the light to take it. Betty looked breathtaking. She wore a sweeping emerald green gown that perfectly complemented her radiant skin, but her most striking accessory was the subtle, elegant silver pin affixed to the bodice of her dress, a caduceus, the symbol of medicine. Dr. Betty Carter had graduated at the top of her accelerated class. Nervous, E.L. murmured, leaning in close as the cameras below began to flash. A little, Betty admitted, her fingers tightening slightly on his arm. I'm used to scrubbing the floors in this building, not being the guest of honor. You own the building now, darling, E.L. chuckled, referring to the recent acquisition his company had made. You can do whatever you want. As they began their descent down the sweeping staircase, a small, vibrant blur of yellow silk broke away from the crowd below and dashed up the stairs to meet them. Mommy! Daddy! Emma cheered, her 8-year-old voice carrying over the string quartet. She practically threw herself into E.L.'s free arm. E.L. hoisted her up effortlessly, pressing a kiss to her cheek. Emma's yellow party dress was beautiful, but she had specifically requested a neckline that dipped just low enough to proudly display the jagged, deep crimson birthmark resting on her collarbone. She no longer thought it was ugly. She knew it was the mark of her family, the mark of fire. Betty looked at her husband, holding their daughter with such absolute, unshakable devotion, and felt a profound peace settle over her soul. The shadows of the past, the abuse of supervisors, the desperate nights, the cruel lies of a false friend had all dissolved. They had started their story in the dark, built on a lie they didn't even know they were living. But here, bathed in the brilliant chandelier light, surrounded by the empire they were building together, the truth was finally out. And the truth was absolutely beautiful. The morning sun filtered through the pristine glass doors of the Emma Carter Medical Initiative headquarters, casting a warm, golden glow across the busy reception area. It had been 4 years since the gala, and Dr. Betty Carter had transformed a mere concept into a thriving reality. Betty walked down the bustling corridor, the crisp white fabric of her lab coat snapping around her legs. She held a sleek digital tablet, her eyes rapidly scanning the medical charts of her morning patients. The facility wasn't just a clinic, it was a sanctuary. It was located right in the heart of the district where she used to scrub hotel floors, a deliberate choice to serve the women who needed it most. Dr. Carter, room 3 is ready for you, a cheerful nurse announced, handing Betty a physical file. Mariah Jenkins. She's 22, a single mother, and she's presenting with severe abdominal pain. She's terrified about the cost. Tell her the foundation covers everything, Betty said smoothly, her professional demeanor layered with deep, genuine empathy. And pull the ultrasound machine into the room. Let's not make her wait for answers. As Betty entered the examination room, she saw the young woman sitting on the edge of the bed, her knuckles white as she clutched her worn purse. She looked exhausted, defensive, and deeply afraid, a mirror image of Betty nearly a decade ago. Mariah, Betty smiled gently, pulling up a rolling stool so she was eye level with the patient, rather than towering over her. I'm Dr. Carter. I hear you're in some pain today. Over the next hour, Betty expertly diagnosed an acute appendicitis, fast-tracked Mariah to the partnered surgical center across town, and personally authorized the Foundation's emergency childcare services to look after Mariah's toddler while she recovered. When Betty finally stepped back into her private office, she let out a long, satisfying breath. The mahogany desk was cluttered with medical journals, framed photos of Emma's school plays, and a single, beautiful silver watch resting under a glass dome, a daily reminder of the night that changed everything. The door clicked open, and EL leaned against the frame. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, holding 2 paper cups from the local independent coffee shop Betty loved. You're working through lunch again, Dr. Carter, EL noted, stepping into the room and setting the coffee down. Betty smiled, walking over and wrapping her arms around his waist. We just saved a young mother from a ruptured appendix and kept her child from going into the foster system while she heals. I think that's worth skipping a salad. EL kissed the top of her head, his arms holding her tight. You are a force of nature, Betty. The board of directors at Apex is still terrified of you after you negotiated that last medical supply contract. Good, Betty laughed, leaning back to look into his dark, loving eyes. Let them be terrified. We have a lot of lives to change. While Betty healed the city's vulnerable, EL protected the perimeter of their hard-won peace. And that perimeter was about to be tested. Miles away, the heavy iron gates of the state penitentiary slid open with a screeching groan. Duke stepped out into the blinding daylight, a worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. 5 years behind bars had hardened him, replacing his reckless gambling energy with a cold, simmering resentment. His first stop was a dingy sports bar on the edge of town. It didn't take long for him to track down an old acquaintance and get caught up on the news he had missed while locked away. Ivy's in the feds, man, the bartender told him, wiping down the sticky counter. Got busted for some massive fraud against that billionaire, E.L. Carter. They say she faked a kid being his. Duke's grip on his cheap beer glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. Faked a kid? He muttered. He knew exactly whose kid that was. He remembered Ivy's terrified face when she packed her bags and disappeared 6 years ago. Carter kept the kid for a while, but then shipped him off somewhere in Europe, the bartender continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in Duke's eyes. Carter married some doctor instead. Living like kings, Duke's mind spun with greedy calculations. E.L. Carter had billions. He had raised Duke's son. He had locked Duke's ex up. In Duke's twisted logic, Carter owed him a massive payout, enough to set him up for life, to keep him quiet about the stolen heir. 3 days later, E.L. Carter's private security detail intercepted a man trying to bypass the secondary gates of the Apex corporate headquarters. E.L. sat in his top-floor office, staring out at the sprawling metropolis, when his head of security entered. "Sir, we have a man downstairs. Name is Duke. He's demanding to see you. Says he has family business to discuss regarding a child." E.L.'s eyes darkened, the temperature in the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees. He had anticipated this day. Bring him to the underground garage. Clear the sector. 10 minutes later, E.L. stepped out of the private elevator into the dimly lit concrete expanse of the VIP parking level. Duke stood there, flanked by 2 massive security guards. He tried to look intimidating, puffing out his chest, but next to the cold, lethal composure of E.L. Carter, he looked like a rat cornered by a lion. "Carter," Duke sneered, though his voice wavered slightly. "You and I need to talk. You stole my kid. You locked up my girl. I want what's mine. 10 million, and I walk away and never mention to the press how you got played by a pawnshop hustler." E.L. didn't say a word. He walked forward slowly, his heavy dress shoes echoing menacingly against the concrete. He stopped just inches from Duke, towering over the ex-convict. "You are gravely mistaken about the position you are in," E.L. said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised absolute destruction. He pulled a sleek black folder from his inner jacket pocket and slapped it hard against Duke's chest. Duke fumbled to catch it, opening it with trembling hands. Inside were heavily redacted legal documents, international custody decrees, and photographs of a young boy in a pristine Swiss boarding school, surrounded by security. That boy is currently a ward of a blind trust in Geneva, EL stated coldly. Legally, Ivy relinquished all parental rights before her incarceration, and legally, you do not exist on his birth certificate. He is protected by international privacy laws and a security detail composed of former special operatives. Duke swallowed hard, looking at the documents. If you ever speak his name, EL continued, leaning in so close Duke could see the lethal promise in his eyes, if you ever approach my company, my estate, my wife, or my daughter, I will not call the police. I will simply erase you. You will become a statistical anomaly, a ghost. Do you understand me? Duke looked into the abyss of the billionaire's eyes and realized he had brought a knife to a nuclear war. The bravado completely drained from his body. He dropped the folder onto the concrete floor and took a stumbling step back. Yeah, Duke choked out, his face pale. I get it. Get out of my city, EL commanded. As Duke practically sprinted toward the exit, EL adjusted his cuffs, his expression smoothing out into absolute calm. He had promised Betty he would protect their family, and EL Carter never broke a promise. The heavy summer rain lashed against the massive windows of the Carter estate, but inside the master bedroom, the atmosphere was warm and filled with a quiet, sacred joy. Betty lay back against a mountain of plush pillows, her face flushed, her hair damp with sweat. She was exhausted, her body aching, but the smile on her face was brighter than 1,000 suns. In her arms rested a tiny, perfectly swaddled bundle. EL sat on the edge of the bed, his broad shoulders hunched forward, completely captivated. He reached out with a single, trembling finger, gently stroking the impossibly soft cheek of his newborn son. He's perfect, EL whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion so deep it threatened to drown him. He has your nose, Betty murmured, shifting the soft blue blanket slightly to get a better look at the sleeping infant. And Emma's stubborn chin. The bedroom door creaked open, and 10-year-old Emma peeked her head in. She was wearing her favorite yellow pajamas, her dark eyes wide with anticipation. Can I come in? She whispered loudly. Come here, superhero, EL smiled, waving her over. Emma scrambled onto the massive bed, careful not to jostle her mother. She leaned over Betty's arm, staring down at her new baby brother with absolute awe. He's so small, Emma breathed. Does he have it, Mommy? Does he have the fire? EL and Betty exchanged a knowing, tender look. Betty gently pulled back the collar of the baby's tiny cotton onesie. There, resting perfectly against the infant's delicate collarbone, was the faintest, jagged outline of a deep crimson mark. The cresting flame. The undeniable legacy of the Carter bloodline. He has it, Emma beamed, gently touching her own birthmark. He's one of us. Yes, he is, EL said, wrapping his large arm around Emma and leaning in to press a kiss against Betty's temple. Betty closed her eyes, letting the profound warmth of her family wash over her. She thought of the cold, terrifying night in the hotel suite, the years of scrubbing floors, the sting of Ivy's betrayal, and the impossible, miraculous path that had led her to this exact moment. The darkness had tried to claim them all. It had tried to extinguish Yale's life with a chemical fire. It had tried to crush Betty beneath the weight of poverty. But they had survived. They had found each other in the shadows, and together, they had built an empire of light. What should we name him? Yale asked softly, his eyes never leaving Betty's radiant face. Betty looked down at her son, the tiny, beautiful embodiment of their resilience and their unwavering truth. Phoenix, Betty said, a tear of pure joy slipping down her cheek. Because out of the ashes, we rise. E.L. smiled, a genuine, soul-deep smile that reached his dark eyes. He held his wife and his children, the true wealth of his life, secure in the knowledge that no lie, no darkness, and no force on earth could ever break them apart.